Hello everyone. This is Debjani, a storyteller from Chennai, India. And today I'm going to share with you, I'm going to read out for you a story that is deeply connected with me. The story named Then As I Kept Going, written by Shahbaz Zaman, and it has been translated by Noora Bahar. So here it is for you. Then, as I kept going, I met an old woman, and that old woman told me a story about a Royal Bengal tiger. The village where she lived, it was canopied with overhanging trees. An impassive breeze blew through the foliage. Internet pizza hadn't reached there yet, but DVD player ran on battery power in the tea stall where I sat sipping tea. I saw some actress on the TV screen dancing to the song Tunky Footer. When I finished my tea with the aftertaste of condensed milk, I started towards the old woman's hut. When I sat in her yard, a naked boy gripped his penis and stared at me. It can be difficult, to understand the ways of the village. The bus I took to cross some miles that stretch was called Saddam Hussein. Then I took another vehicle to cross a fair bit of distance, and that also had a name, Nosiban. I heard a village boy had transformed a rice harvester into what had become Nosiban. A rice harvester into a vehicle? Wow. Just as a magician transforms a handkerchief ta-da, into a bunny. Then I took a boat, a familiar mode of transportation, right? But the boatman sang. He wasn't supposed to be singing at that time. Here the global stock market had collapsed. Probably the boatman had some potatoes at home. And with potatoes in stomach, one cannot sing melodiously. Yet the boatman sang. He sang, I row my boat all night. I watch as the night turns to dawn. Yet my boat still stands where it was. What had I hoped for and for whom? My heart sinks in grief, and with it my will to live. It looked like the boatman couldn't make any progress. He seemed stuck, going round in circles, much like the economic collapse. Then I got off the boat. I walked on foot. I stepped on patches of grass. I'm used to walking, you see. I've walked from the shores of Sri Lanka all the way to the shores of Malaysia. Then as I was walking, I met that old woman. When I sat in the old woman's lawn, a sudden gust of wind blew a bunch of jujubes onto the tin roof. I noticed the stooping jujube tree above. Beside the tree, there was a tube well. Someone was pumping water out of it. And the naked boy, squishing his spinners, ran to collect the fallen jujubes. He never came back. In such an unfamiliar context, I began to think what role Facebook and Twitter played in the Arab Spring. Soon the night fell hazily. Darkness reigns in the night. What's special about night time is that it doesn't give one the scope to perceive something in minute details. Therefore, The poverty of the village didn't seem too explicit. The old woman sat on her lawn and started wiping the glass covering of her oil lamp with an old piece of rag. I noticed her fingers. Fingers are peculiar. Fingers have their unique personalities. The fact that Shaila had hurt me wasn't much of an issue. But, uh, you know, rather not being able to remember what her fingers were like was something that was bothering me more. If Rodin had a good look of that old woman's fingers, I'm sure he would have used a semblance of those fingers in his sculptures. The old woman's fingers were just like text. With those fingers she had purchased maggot-infested eggplant from the farmer's market. With those fingers she had washed the body of the chairman's daughter who had died by suicide. The old woman's fingers were as intricate as a village life. And this complex old woman then told me a story. A story of a Royal Bengal tiger. The old woman started. A long time ago. Ha. This reminded me of fairy tales, you see. Fairy tales usually start by once upon a time. Fairy tales are not that relatable because usually they are about some rajas in some faraway land. But the old woman's story was about Sikandar Mia. It was a tale of that same village. The old woman said, Sikandar was a poor farmer. That wasn't totally unexpected, not surprising at all. Because, rural farmers are supposed to be poor. In the West, we have heard about the affluents living in the rural areas. But here, villages are sanctuaries for the poor. Then the old woman said that Sikandar lived with his wife, Julekha. Julekha. When I was a kid, I knew Julekha to be a princess. But nowadays who differentiates between the names of the kings and their subjects? I've heard rural girls name like Victoria, Elizabeth. Sikandar's daughter, of course, had a much ordinary name, Moina. So Sikandar, with wife Julekha and daughter Moina, had settled in that village. I didn't get any hints by hearing out the exposition of the story. Are you getting any hint? No, right? Here the story unfolds. Then the old woman said that when work would be scarce in the village, Sikandar would go missing. No one knew where he would be off to, not even Julekha. This wasn't something totally unexpected. Because this kind of internal migration between villages, uh, was old news and falls within classical migration theory. Pull factor, push factor, both are at work here. And since the story was from from a long, long time ago, microcredit must have been unheard of in that village. If it had been around, Sikandar may have bought and driven a pedal van and paid off the debt in weekly installments. But would that end his poverty? That's a different question for a different day. Sikandar definitely belonged to a generation that came much before the debate over whether or not microcredit can eradicate poverty. So, what was evident though was that Sikandar would go missing. When Sikandar would disappear, Julekha's sufferings would begin. Poverty would slither into her home just like a python. Not being able to think of any other alternative, Julekha would work as a domestic help at a few households. On some days, Julekha would tie up one end of her wet sari to the fence and, much like Draupadi, would go round and round unfolding her sari and would barely cover herself with the other end while holding onto the fence. Since Julekha had just one sari, she had to stand in this position until her sari dried up. Against the backdrop of the orchard of betelnut trees, here Julekha's posture with an unfurled orange sari was an absolutely a synchrony of sorrow and beauty. Even though Sikandar Mia would go missing, he would eventually turn, perhaps after many days. Sikandar would come back home at night. He would bring candy cane for Moina. The old woman said that during her childhood, colorful candy cane was a sensation of distant lands. On the way to the village, I had marveled at the puffy packets of the chips, you know, uh, that were hanging from the small grocery stores. It reminded me of the ballooned pregnant cats or the dusty Coke bottles stacked in the corner of those stores. But I could guess that the candy cane was much more enigmatic than these items. Sikandar would bring a sari for Julekha. Well, she had already one orange sari. Perhaps this time Sikandar would bring red or green. Sikandar would also bring customary alta for Julekha. In the deep of the night, Julekha would light up an oil lamp and dye her feet red with alta. Moina would fall asleep while sucking on the candy cane. Then, after putting out the lamp, Sikandar and Julekha would talk all night. Julekha would speak of her sorrows. She would cry softly and she would laugh with her lips pressed together. Wu would say, "There is no water in the pond. Why does the leaf float? There is no show of your lover. Why do you laugh so?" At the crack of the dawn, the light would reveal altar stains on Sikandar's body. I could understand that this had a sexual connotation. But the old woman chose to keep it inferential, you see. During the narration, I noticed a solid presence of the old woman's fingers. Every trivial little details were made significant by the various gestures of her fingers. The story's inciting incident came afterwards. Once, when Sikandar went away, he was gone for longer than usual. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. But Sikandar did not return. Julekha and Moina were grief-stricken. Sikandar Mia was a no-show. Julekha was devastated. If one could borrow Thakumar Juli's language, one could say, Julekha cried like a bashi. She beat her chest, smacked her forehead, became hysterical from having to bear her woes, and hit her head with a stone until all her burning misery fizzled out. And yet, even the ant remained unmoved by Julekha's wretchedness. However, Sikandar couldn't remain absent forever. At least for the sake of the story, he had to come back. And he did. Apparently, he had been to Kurkab city, hundreds of miles away from this village. The old woman did not know where the city was. All she knew was that Kurkab was a city of ascetics. Sikandar had become a disciple of a sadhu there, and this time on return, he hadn't brought along with him candy cane or alta or sari. But this time, Sikandar bought a pot of water given to him by a sadhu. So as usual, Sikandar returned at night, and instead of usual gifts, this time he presented the mysterious pot of water under the light of the oil lamp. A technical question, however, remains unanswered is how Sikandar managed to bring that pot of water all the way from the Kurkab city? I mean, with all the contents within it intact. But we should not ruin this magic of the story by asking such technical questions. We are not that stupid. The old woman took all my attention now towards the pot of water under the oil lamp because that was where the heart of the story lay. Julekha and Moina looked at the water. The water that trembled within the pot looked just like ordinary water. No matter how long and how hard they stared at the water, they found nothing special about it. The mystery was revealed by Sikandar. He said, "The sadhu has said that I can be whoever I want to be if I splash some of this water on my body." Julekha and Moina exchanged their glances. Julekha then let out a laugh and said, as if Sikandar was determined to prove the potency of the water, and he said, "First, you have got to tell me what I should turn into, and then you will see its power." Julekha couldn't stop laughing, and yet she managed to say, "I don't know, what can you be?" At this point, the old woman took a break and started munching on a new bitter leaf along with some chewing tobacco. I wanted to know what sort of transformation Sikandar went through. The old woman started. Sikandar said, "All right, Moina, you go first. Tell me what you want me to be, and then your mother can have her turn." Moina said, No. Ma first." Sikandar said, "Okay, Julekha, you go first." In a fit of laughter, Julekha said, "All right, turn into a king with a pearl necklace." Sikandar responded, "Fine, Moina, it's your turn now." Moina said, "Turn into a tiger. I want to see a tiger." Sikandar said, Fine, I will turn into both. I'll be a king, I'll be a tiger. Which one should I be first? All right, I'm going to turn into Buenos Tiger first, and then turn into a king. A tiger was introduced at this point of the narration, and from here onwards, the story became that of a tiger. Under the light emanating from the oil lamp, Julekha, Moina, and Sikandar became involved with Tiger King game. He instructed to take a handful of water from the pot. Yes, Sikandar was, explaining all the rules of the game. So he instructed that handful of water had to be taken and had to be uttered tiger, tiger, tiger 3 times in a row, as if in a mantra. And then the water had to be splashed on him. And immediately Sikandar would transform into a tiger. Then to bring him back to his human form, once again handful of water had to be taken from the pot and human had to be uttered thrice and splashed on him, and he would turn back into his original human form. And then again 3 times for the king. And next, Sikandar would turn into a king. So in this manner, Sikandar would keep metamorphosing. Sikandar told Julekha, "So let's begin. Bismillah." Julekha hesitated. With cupped hands, she took a handful of water from the pot. Next to her, Moina chuckled. Her eyes were dazzling. She was, suppressing her excitement and curiosity. Just as instructed, Julekha uttered the word tiger, tiger, tiger 3 times and splashed the water in her hands onto Sikandar's body. Indeed, Sikandar began to gradually transform right afterwards. He began to form large canines, sharp claws, and eventually the sadhu's words came true when Sikandar completed his transformation. He actually turned into a tiger. Sikandar's transformation, as described by that old woman, reminded me of Michael Jackson's music video, Thriller. Afterwards, the story went through a dramatic diversion. Moina had wanted to see a tiger, and she had been waiting with inquisitiveness to see one affront. But she could not have anticipated how she would react when a formidable tiger would actually appear would be there in the same room as hers. Thus, seeing a royal Bengal tiger right in front of their eyes terrified Moina and even Julekha. They forgot that the tiger was actually Sikandar. Moina screamed and ran out of the room. That's when the trouble began. As she dashed for the door, Moina's foot hit the pot. The pot toppled over and all the contents spilled. And so the Tiger King game went on to become a catastrophe. Without any of the magical water left in the pot, how would it be possible for the tiger to transform back into his human form? Since all of the water that had been blessed by the sadhu's mantras had been spilled, there was no way. Distraught, Julekha banged her forehead against the pillar and cried, Allah, what am I going to do now? Sikandar, in his tiger form, looked at Julekha dolefully, walked around in circles within the hut, and moaned. Earlier, the thoughts in my head were jumping around like a chimp that jumps from one branch of the tree to another. At times, my thoughts were about the Egyptian flag, at times about Shaila, and at other times about Satyajit Ray. But at this point in the story, my chimp-like thoughts stopped leaping about. A man was trapped in a tiger's body while involved in a childish play and couldn't return in his true form. I felt that this particular crisis was more complex than the complexities of the Arab Spring or the complications in my relationship with Shaila. I thought to myself, haven't we all, at some point of the time or the other, somehow been stuck with an undesired facade we have created in our lives? This dormant tragedy of the human existence troubled me. Julekha went out into the yard and brought Moina back into the hut. She wiped away her tears, pointed at the baffled tiger, and said, "Don't be afraid, this is your father." But it was difficult for Moina to grasp the fact that this massive animal standing before her was indeed her father. With watery eyes, she looked at the tiger in wonderment. Sikandar, in his tiger form, also looked at his daughter ruefully. The tiger, Julekha, Moina, all felt perplexed while coming up against this predicament that had no resolution. The entire episode took place in the dead of the night. And the tiger, as in Sikandar, was very cautious not to growl. So the neighbors had no clue about the dramatic incident that had taken place in Julekha's hut. But dawn was fast approaching. The unstoppable light of a new day would soon spread all over. The village folk would be up and about in no time. If they would see the tiger turn Sikandar, they would inevitably beat him up into a pulp. That is when Julekha came to her senses. She told Sikandar to quickly flee to the nearby hills. She said, go into the woods and save yourself. Julekha opened the back door, stroked the tiger and let him out. The tiger looked at Julekha helplessly, walked slowly away from the hut and headed for the wooded hills nearby, while it was still dark out. Dawn broke. Julekha didn't tell anyone about what had happened. She strictly instructed Moina to keep mum about it. Anxiety, despair, and sorrow overpowered Julekha, and she secretly wept alone. At the end of the day, when darkness loomed over, a tiger's growls were heard from the distant hills. The villagers felt terrorized. A neighbor came and told Julekha, "Have you heard? There is a tiger in the woods." Julekha remained silent. At night, she lay on the bed, held Moina close to her, heard the tiger's growls, and didn't get any sleep. It wasn't exactly the noise of a tiger growling. It sounded more like moans. A Royal Bengal tiger was roaming in the woods. Julekha knew it was Sikandar. She knew it was Sikandar crying in the woods. The old woman paused at this point, and with her fingers she rolled the wick of the oil lamp and elongated it. Shaila's fingers suddenly flashed before my eyes. Shaila had covered its a lit torchlight with the 5 fingers of one hand. The light had become trapped in her fingers. Each one of her slender fingers had seemed like a stream of crimson lava erupting from a volcano. She had suddenly turned off the switch of the torchlight and said, "Give it some time, and only then you will see cream forming on milk's surface." But let's not get sidetracked. Let's get back to Julekha and her tiger. Naturally, once Sikandar had transformed into a tiger, the dark cloud of sorrow loomed over Julekha yet again. Once again she had to return to working as a domestic help. But did Sikandar live the life of a tiger till the end? The question was yet to be answered. On one dark night, when the new moon was barely visible, Sikandar was able to slip in to Julekha's hut, unnoticed by the villagers. He rubbed himself against the fence. Julekha stepped out with an oil lamp, saw the tiger, and she quickly put her finger over her mouth. Shh. Cautiously, she led Sikandar into the hut, bolted the door shut. Silently, Sikandar dragged his massive frame and sat on the floor. Julekha stroked his whole body. She asked, "How have you been? Have you been eating well?" The tiger moaned softly. Julekha wiped away her tears with her sari's anchal. Julekha spoke of her sorrows while caressing the tiger's body. She wondered out loud, what sins have caused this family's ruin? What sins have caused Julekha's misfortune? Julekha told Sikandar that the local leader of the village had cast an evil eye on her. Now she was afraid that Sikandar would get up and run towards the leader's house. After all, Sikandar knew where he lived. To distract him, Julekha woke Moina up and said, "Moina, look, your father is here." Rubbing her eyes, Moina got up, but this time she wasn't startled at the sight of a tiger lying down. The tiger turned his head towards Moina. With excitement in her voice, Julekha informed Sikandar that Moina had recently started learning how to read the Quran from a Maulavi. She said, "Come, Moina, read something for your father." Sleepily, Moina brought the Arabic alphabet book down from the shelf, sat down next to the tiger and started. Alif Zabar, A, B Zabar, Ba, T Zabar, Da. The tiger blinked. His facial expressions remained like that of a tiger's, which Julekha could not read. It was late into the night of a full moon, and this solitary tiger was assessing his daughter's Arabic language skills. The threat of dawn drew close. Before the break of the dawn, the tiger listened to the strings of his wife's sorrows and the recitation of holy words by his daughter and headed out vigilantly. The chairman's daughter, who had died by suicide and whose body the old woman had washed, wore a nosepin, which had been the cause behind this suicide. There had been a lot of bloodshed in the village because of that nosepin. The dense foliage in the village made it a comforting place for sure. But the village was not as simple as the impassive breeze that blew through it. However, there is no scope to unveil all the mysteries of the village within this story. For now, we will just have to center our attention on this mysterious story of the tiger. we will have to focus on Julekha. So Julekha's worst crisis came at this point in the story. Julekha's daughter, Moina, developed a complicated illness. One day, out of the blue, she couldn't get out of her bed. Her legs had got numb. The old woman told me that this happens as a result of thapra wind. She informed me that the alga wind, the nuli wind, and thapra wind are all part of the wind. The thapra wind lies in wait and catches people off guard. The one who is attacked by it feels like they have been smacked hard, and with that smack, their legs go numb. They lose mobility. It's hard to understand why the Thapra wind had shown no mercy to the daughter of the man who had transformed into a tiger, roaming and moaning in the woods. The villagers said that it was an incurable condition. A shaman from a distant village arrived one day. He said he knew the cure. Julekha looked at him anxiously. Needless to say, since the story was about a tiger and since the crisis revolved around a tiger, it could be hoped that the resolution would have to do something with the tiger only, right? I could see that the old woman's tale was going in that direction. According to her, the shaman said the cure to the algawin disease is fox meat. The fox fat. The cure to the newlywed disease is gecko. The gecko fat. And the cure to the thaprawin disease is tiger's meat. Moina would have to consume tiger's meat to be able to walk again. Not tiger's milk, tiger's meat. The shaman had fox fat, he had gecko fat, but I hope you understand now, he didn't have any tiger's meat. The story took a new turn at this point. How would they get hold of a tiger's meat? Sikandar the tiger was roaming in the woods. I waited to know Sikandar's role in the resolution of the crisis. The old woman said that Julekha now waited for the next new moon. She knew that's when Sikandar would come. That's when she planned on having a talk with him. Perhaps he would know something about a dead tigers in the woods. Maybe he would be able to bring home a chunk of flesh bitten out of the dead tiger's corpse. Julekha waited. Sure enough, on the next new moon, Sikandar came to Julekha's hut, rubbed himself against the fence. Julekha got out of the bed in a jiffy. She fixed her disheveled sari and unbolted the door and let the tiger in. As usual, the tiger sat next to the bed. Moina was fast asleep. As soon as the tiger was inside the hut, Julekha hugged him and sobbed. She couldn't speak. Shutting his mouth and eyes, the tiger moaned. Julekha's tears fell on the tiger's stripes. At some point, Julekha wiped away her tears and snort and said, Moina is very sick. The shaman had come over. The tiger opened his eyes. Julekha gave Sikandar all the details. At the end, she told him about the cure. The tiger meat. She wept some more. Sikandar turned his tiger head towards Julekha. He made an obscure noise. Julekha thought about the prophet who understood the language of animals and birds. At this moment, she wished she could understand the language of tigers. Julekha now looked into the tiger's eyes and said, Did you get what I said? The tiger blinked. They could hear Moina breathing while she slept. Juleka asked, do you know of any old half-dead tiger in the woods? Can't you kill the old beast and bring some of his meat? Or is it there a tiger that has died in the past couple of days? Sikandar roared softly. His long, fine whiskers trembled in the breeze. Juleka said, go and search in the woods. The shaman said, a small chunk of meat will do. If you can get some, I can cook it for Moina. Please try, won't you? The hidden expression between the tiger's sharp teeth and whiskers was something that Juleka could not understand. Meanwhile, they didn't notice that the eastern horizon had turned crimson. Juleka got up quickly and told Sikandar, hey, go, quickly, go. It's almost light out. But the tiger had no sense of urgency. Juleka pushed the tiger with all her might. But where she would get the strength enough to push such a massive tiger? Dawn was cracking. After a little while, the tiger, aka Sikandar, got up. Julekha unbolted the door swiftly. He slowly walked out and stood on the lawn. But he didn't move any further. Julekha nearly screamed, go quickly, go, people will see you. The tiger remained motionless. The azan was heard after a little while. The sky started to lighten up in no time. This time Julekha stood in front of the tiger and said, what are you doing? Why are you standing here? Can't you hear the azan? Men were rushing towards the mosque. As soon as the muezzin said, Asalatu khairam minam nayam, the tiger suddenly let out a mighty roar. Muezzin Azan came to a halt. He was bewildered by how close the tiger's roar, could have come from. The mosque goers stopped in their tracks. From a distance, someone spotted the tiger in Julekha's lawn. He shouted, hey, the tiger is here! The tiger is here in the village! Within no time, innumerable people ran towards Julekha's hut with sticks and spears in their hands. They cried, get him! Get the tiger! Horror struck, Julekha kept screaming at Sikandar, begging him to flee. But soon enough, the countless men closed in on the tiger. The tiger remained unaffected. He stood in the lawn motionlessly. With folded hands, Julekha implored the villagers not to kill the tiger. She tried to make them understand the tiger was nobody else but Moina's father, Sikandar. The mob assumed that she had become delusional as a result of losing Sikandar. They asked Julekha to step aside and then they attacked the tiger with whatever weapon each carried. The tiger didn't try to escape at all. He didn't even show any sign of protest. He was wounded by sticks and spears. Standing at a distance, Julekha begged for his life. The bedridden Moina also put her head out of the window and cried, please don't kill my father. No one gave ear to the delusional mother or daughter. They hit the tiger relentlessly. The non-protesting tiger collapsed at one point after getting beaten to a pulp. Sikandar met his death. The public rejoiced. The killer youth carried Sikandar, aka Tiger's body, around the village, Julekha fell unconscious. The old woman told me how Sikandar willingly died. By doing so, he actually presented his body as an antidote for his ailing daughter. After all the celebration died down, the villagers remembered Moina and the shaman's prescription. The villagers then proceeded to skin the tiger and get a chunk of its flesh. Yes, dear listeners, they got a chunk of tiger aka Sikandar's flesh. And Julekha fainted every now and then. Against her wishes, the villagers cooked Sikandar, aka the tiger's meat, and then they fed it to Moina. After having consumed her own father's meat, Moina eventually recovered and could walk once again. The old woman The old woman ended the tiger's tale at this point. I bid her farewell. In my head, I could only hear a tiger's cries from distant hills. That was the story. Then, as I kept going.